Good morning, everybody. I'm Chloe. I'm the festival programmer here, and welcome to the 11th BFI Future Film Festival. It's my great pleasure to introduce you this screening, which is our first masterclass of the festival, which is the Editor Masterclass with Joe Bini, and it's in partnership with our headline sponsors, Lacey. There's lots of opportunities to meet them across the festival, so do look out for them. They're really great guys, want to have a chat with you about how they can help you be better filmmakers. So today's masterclass is really special for me. Joe is somebody that's been on my wish list to come and speak at Future Film ever since I started programming here 4 years ago. So when I heard that he had moved to London, I was incredibly excited. And yeah, I hope that you guys can learn a lot from him. He's an incredible editor. He's worked on some of my favourite films, and I'm sure that you will get to see some of his amazing work up here. So I'd now like to welcome to the stage and give him a warm round of applause, Joe Bini.
Hello. That is a nice looking audience. You don't always get nice looking audiences for film things, but this is a nice looking audience, so I'm excited. Just wanted to say the way I thought we would do this is I'm going to speak just from something I wrote in the last couple of days, and this will probably take me maybe 20 minutes or something to read, and I'm just going to kind of throw out some ideas about things we could talk about, we could think about, and after that, it's kind of loose. I have a lot of clips from films that I worked on, but I'm hoping you will ask questions or it can become a bit of a dialogue, so we'll see how that goes. I also wanted to say, so we're gonna have some slides and some other things. My partner, Maya Hawk, is doing the audio visual today. Thank you, Maya, for agreeing to come and do this. And I'd just like to point out that she is in fact using a C drive. Okay, so here we go. So this is a kind of a funny moment for me to be lecturing about editing, because I am actually sort of moving away from editing in my life and pursuing my goal of being a filmmaker in my own right. Which is not to say that editing is not filmmaking, because it is, but anyway, this is a bit of a funny moment for me. I met a filmmaker just 2 days ago, and she was trying to get me to agree to edit her film, and she said, "I know this is unlikely because I hear that you are transitioning right now." And I thought, I like that, I am transitioning, I'm totally transitioning. I like this whole term, transitioning. It comes from the LGBT community, and I like what it represents. It acknowledges that we are all always in a state of transition. We are always in between states of being. So I started out as just plain person, and then I transitioned into being a songwriter, and then I transitioned into being a filmmaker, and then I transitioned into being an editor, and now I am back into transitioning into being a filmmaker, which I realize is the transition that I've ultimately been on my whole life. So I want to ask you, what are you transitioning from and into? So one question, how many of you are consider yourselves editors or see yourselves as transitioning into editors? Show of hands. There we go. Here is my advice to you about transitioning, about your transitional choice. Don't do it. I'm not attempting to talk you out of pursuing editing. Rather, I'm asking you to consider the process you are going through is really about transitioning into being a filmmaker or a dramatist. Editor, generally speaking, is a hierarchical term used in the film business in the same sense that DOP or director are hierarchical terms. These terms are useful, vital even, in the production of a film, as everything tends to fall apart if you don't have strong hierarchy, but they are not so useful to your vision of yourself as an artist. And that's chiefly what I'm interested in talking to you about this morning. All of us here and now transitioning into being filmmakers, into being dramatists, into being artists. I wish to tell you about my experience as an editor, all the while knowing that a move such as the one I'm attempting to make now is something that takes up your entire life. So I hope all of us in this room are on that same transitional path, that we all share this in common. We all want to be filmmakers. So I hope you understand that since I'm in this transitional state, I don't actually feel like talking about editing all that much. If you want to talk about editing per se, you're probably going to have to bring that. You're going to probably have to ask me about it. But there is much to be said for editing's usefulness for a person who wants to be a filmmaker. Because editing is where you learn to speak the language of cinema. You learn how to tell stories using pictorial and sound imagery, and you learn structure. And that, in the end, is a lot of what filmmaking is ultimately about. That is why it is essential that every filmmaker in every capacity must have a deep understanding of editing. Editing cannot be a compartmentalized thing, where you hire someone to operate a machine for you. It must be a meeting of minds, and all parties must be thinking like editors. Lynn Ramsey and Andrea Arnold, two of the filmmakers I've worked with, as far as I know, cannot operate an Avid system, let alone operate a system as horrific as Premiere. Werner Herzog, when last I checked, he's another filmmaker I work with. When last I checked, he had not even mastered the art of copying and pasting in a Word document. This is true. But I can tell you without hesitation that all of these people have mastered the art of thinking like an editor. That's part of what makes them great directors. But from you, young filmmaking people, I expect much more. No matter what filmmaking role you ultimately transition into, I expect all of you to be able to actually physically edit films. Because editing is the best way for you to learn the language of cinema, and the very best editing tools are available to you on your laptop, so there really is no excuse for you not learning how to use them, right? Making the analogy to word communication, every person who writes anything needs to have a basic understanding of how to use the tools involved. A pencil, a computer, keyboard, sentence structure, essay form versus inner monologue. If we were writing a story together, it would naturally be assumed that both of us would physically formulate the actual wording of the text. And that is the point we need to get to with filmmaking. It needs to be less of a hierarchy between a perceived director and an editor, and more of an easy alliance between people who speak a similar language. In order for this to happen, the language itself needs to become less elitist, and I see that it is doing just that. I imagine that one day it will be taught in grammar school. I imagine people conversing in it, and you already see that kind of thing on social media. My friend Carol once showed me rushes from a documentary she continues to make in Afghanistan. At one point in the rushes, Carol asks a matronly Afghani woman seated at a sewing machine, where did she learn to sew? From my grandmother, the woman says. And how about you? Did you learn filmmaking from your grandmother? It would be an excellent world when we can all proudly answer, why, yes, I did learn filmmaking from my grandmother. And that's exactly where I think we are headed. So I've had an amazing 25 plus year career as an editor. And it's been an incredible hands-on way to learn the craft of being a dramatist. A craft that in essence involves how to structure shots into scenes and scenes into stories. I've had the great luck of working closely with some seriously talented dramatists, each of them with their own approach to storytelling, their own obsessions, their own way of seeing the world. In all such cases, we edited the films that we made, we edited them together, because editing is at least a two-person job. And during the editing of these films, I was never made to feel that I was somehow below these directors. I was always the co-filmmaker. My collaborators always gave me the creative space to try things and fail, and to not have to have all the answers, but always to feel free to explore. They did this because they recognized that this was the best thing for the film, and in the end, that's all that really matters. It's not an ego thing. Over years spent editing other people's films, I came to the realization that I really got off on the challenge of structuring narratives in cinematic language. I started my editing career cutting feature-length, unscripted documentaries. And as I moved more and more into doing fiction films, which was always my interest, I somehow ended up working with fiction directors whose filmmaking style, whether it was scripted or semi-scripted, allowed for a lot of dramatic exploration in the editing room. So I was lucky in this way, and in that sense, while I consider myself a dramatist, I am not the usual definition of a dramatist. The usual definition of a dramatist tends towards the screenwriter or the playwright. And those are beautiful jobs. But the thing about those jobs, particularly when you define what it is to be a screenwriter in the modern world, what you are ultimately doing is you are crafting a document that sells an idea for a film. A film that might come into being in some form, possibly not this form exactly, at some later date. So might, possibly, maybe. In the editing room, you are not working with the idea of a film. You are working with a film. Making movies not out of the abstraction of written words, but rather out of the actual ingredients of film. Pictorial and auditory imagery. I suppose one could make the argument that unscripted documentary film editing, where I learned the craft, shares more in common with narrative screenwriting than it does with the accepted Hollywood concept of narrative film editing, which has the editor at least 3 steps removed from the initial creative impulse of the story. This always struck me as a bit odd. So there's another kind of filmmaking, in my view, this is a superior form of filmmaking, whereby the editing is on the same plane as the screenwriting. In this form of filmmaking, whether it is fiction or nonfiction, you are defining the story and its players as you go, trying to create a memorable experience for the audience through the reality of the filmed material that sits in front of you. All of the usual caveats of dramaturgy still apply. You need to create memorable characters. You need to focus on the intricacies of plot structure and the emotional involvement that comes from both, but the building blocks themselves are rooted in something that goes beyond the limitations of one person's imagination, a screenwriter's imagination. The screenwriter's imagination, while often an awesome thing, is ultimately limited by the fact that it is coming from a single person's worldview. It is also even more limited by the fact that it is word-bound. It is an attempt to describe in words the blueprint for an art form which ultimately is not about words. In this sense, it is always somewhat doomed to fail, I feel. This type of filmmaking I want to discuss with you today goes beyond these limitations. It is a language of filmmaking that uses the inherent power of the medium to conjure the most emotionally expressive and engaging form of drama that moving pictures have to offer. It is what we might call, for lack of a better phrase, the cinematic language. This is a weird term since cinema, the idea of going into a theater and watching a movie, is becoming less and less of a thing that people do, but it remains appropriate in that it speaks to a way of using moving images to express ideas and emotions. That will always be the treasured goal. So mostly what I wish to discuss with you today is an attempt to arrive at some definition of what a language of cinema consists of. And I do hope also that this ends up being a discussion between us. I hope you will talk to me about your thoughts on this matter, and that you will feel free to express your doubts and disbeliefs. Because one essential ingredient to being a filmmaker or a collaborative artist generally is, and please hear me when I say this, you have to learn how to disagree with people. This has not come easily for some of us. It certainly did not come easily for me. But I have learned to embrace it, and you must also. You must learn to disagree without getting offended or upset, without taking things personally, without shutting down. You must learn to disagree in a respectful manner, always endeavoring to see the other person's point of view, but hanging on to the fact that your trepidations are always in some way valid and worthy of being discussed. It's funny because I'm seeing a lot of people take that about disagreeing. I'm guessing it's from an experience you're having right now. If you find yourself in a circumstance where you're working with a director or someone who does not give you room for contrary ideas or accept your way of expressing contrary ideas, then you probably need to look elsewhere for your creative collaborations. Okay, so let me try to identify some of the ingredients I think that make up cinema, or rather cinematic language. Let's start with this. Because one of the hallmarks of my work as a filmmaker has always been my ability to work in both narrative and documentary forms. People are always asking me what the difference is between fiction and nonfiction filmmaking. Or as part of an ongoing modern stupidity, there's this question about integrating fiction elements into nonfiction shows or non-scripted into scripted. Everybody seems interested in that right now, or at least they did the last time I checked. I get annoyed in answering that question because I think it is the wrong question to ask in the first place. To me, there isn't a whole lot of difference between fiction and nonfiction filmmaking. You still try to achieve a lot of the same goals. Again, good characterization, good plotting, good pacing, and emotional involvement. Both forms have their own strengths and weaknesses, which we can discuss. But in the end, I think it's a waste of time for filmmakers to spend a lot of their energy thinking about fiction and nonfiction. Here are 3 things that I think are more important for you to focus on your filmmaking attention on. Is there water? All right, so number 1 is present tense. I value present tense. That is, things happening in front of the camera, and therefore happening in front of the audience in the present moment. Not looking back, but now. Primary source as opposed to secondary source. That is why I generally despise interview-based documentary films, even though I've edited a few of them over the years. They tend to be looking back films. You have scenes like this. It was 1975, and I stood over here in this very room, and through, although that chair wasn't there, and then through that door came Stanley Kubrick. And then we cut to a shot, and it has high-key lighting, and it has like smoke. And we see somebody walking in who's kind of disheveled, and we know, oh, I think that's supposed to be Stanley Kubrick, and this is happening in the guy's mind, right? And then it cuts to a newscast, and the newscaster has funny hair, and you realize, oh, it must be 1975. And the newscaster says, you know, the BFI today, Stanley Kubrick. It's this kind of thing. And so even though the thing of Stanley Kubrick is supposed to be happening in the present tense, it's not. We all know this is all some kind of looking back at something in the past. But I don't like that. I think it has no place in cinema, because cinema, the language of cinema is essentially about present tense. That is the essence of the medium. The power that cinema can bring in ways that no other art form can is present tense. Think about this. Fiction films consist of essentially fake made-up stories, but everything in them, whether a flashback or a flash forward, is told in the language of present tense. I edited a film with Lynn Ramsey called We Need to Talk About Kevin. In this film, we intercut between 3 periods of a woman's life. All of the scenes take place in different time frames, but all of them come down in the present tense, and you are never confused as to where you are in time. That is the power of cinema. So in a nutshell, always be making films in present tense. Always be making sure that stuff is happening in front of the camera. And when I say stuff happening in front of the camera, I mean action and imagery. I do not mean people talking. Which brings me to my second point. The building blocks I wish to use to accomplish my dramatic goals are scenes that are composed of not words but images. Please take up your pens or put your fingers to the keyboard now, as I'm going to give you 10 words that encapsulate everything I have learned in my career as an editor. These are shocking words, so I hope you're ready to receive them. Are you ready to receive the 10 shocking words? Okay, you are. All right, here we go. Nobody really cares what people are saying in your film. People want to feel that your film is showing them something that is truthful to their everyday existence, even if your film takes place in the past or in the future. Especially in those cases, people want to be touched on an emotional level. They want to experience through emotion, because for most people, that is how they have experienced most of the significant moments in their lives. And the language of cinema is the closest correlation that they have to the experience of their everyday lives. It's true. And I would make the argument to you that even in our everyday lives, words, while the most prevalent, are the least effective form of communication. In my experience, a touch on a shoulder or a look stolen from across the room is more telling than anything that can be expressed in a monologue, no matter how long. This is not because words are inaccurate, it's just the contrary. It is precisely because the accuracy and definitiveness of words makes them unsuitable for expressing things that are complex, changeful, and ambiguous. Words quickly fade because they are dependent on temporal and social factors. Images are indelible across all borders and times. It is for this reason that cinema, in its brief history, has been able to cross so many cultural boundaries, because it speaks in the superior language of images. Images, to be clear, do not necessarily have to be pictorial or photographic. Sound creates images. Music creates images. Things are imagistic in my mind if they conjure emotional beats that feel primary to me, that allow me to experience things as if I am the first one ever to experience them. I don't think words in cinema are capable of doing this with anywhere near the same power. Words become an abstraction in cinema. They lead you away from what you must fundamentally do as a dramatist, that being to create an emotional experience for the audience that keeps them watching. Which leads me to my third point. Simply stated, the narrative effect that I have gotten the most juice out of in my career as a dramatist can be summarized in this way. This is the effect I'm trying to create in an audience. I am completely engaged with the characters in this film, and I have no fucking idea what is going to happen next. To me, this is the effect you are always striving for, and it is more important than pretty much anything else. It seems to me that it's much more important than, say, the satisfying ending. Because if I keep you engaged with my characters and not knowing what is going to be coming next, you will continue to watch my film until the end, even if you're dissatisfied by the end. It seems to me also that this is where the power of our current obsession with unscripted nonfiction television lies. Perhaps it's more likely in people's mind that they're going to encounter more surprising twists in the realm of something that is derived from real life rather than conjured from the mind of a screenwriter. And I cannot disagree with that impulse. The problem is that in truth, a lot of the unscripted stuff is sadly pretty scripted. And that's how people in power would like to remain, because the actual process of doing unscripted filmmaking is quite risky. It requires a process that most producers are unwilling to go for. It's also what makes it exciting for filmmakers. So go figure. All right. So my stated goal as a dramatist is to tell stories in the cinematic language using ideas like the three ones I just mentioned. And to do this, first and foremost, I need to learn to speak and to be spoken to in the language of imagery. I have to learn to let images come to me in their own way, on their own time, often in opposition to my stated schemata. Because images, as opposed to words, do not necessarily come into being with a specific agenda in mind. Sometimes images just are, and you have to learn to work on their terms. So how does one approach this? For a start, consider the difference between the concepts of longing versus wanting. Wanting is clear, purposeful, and urgent. It is driven by the will, always with a goal clearly in view. Longing, by contrast, is something that happens between us and another thing. It is not directed by the will, and it is not is not an aim with the ultimate goal of some kind of acquisition. But instead, longing is something like a desire for union or a desire for a reunion. A lot of the process of being a filmmaker consists of wanting to make sense of things in your film. Obviously, this is something you're going to spend a lot of time doing. However, truly inspired filmmaking requires something more from you, something that is much more elusive. You need to be able to make associations between wildly different ideas or concepts and find the tension and connections between them. You cannot always will that into existence, no matter how much you might want it to be so. Wanting is all about focusing attention and thereby deliberately narrowing the range of your possibilities. This is not always a good thing. Sometimes, in order to be open to real connections, you need to step away from efforts to produce something and just relax. This can be difficult to do when you're under a deadline, but it is an essential ingredient to great filmmaking. You have to take a step back in order to broaden your attention so that you can see things in the material that may not at first be obvious. You have to long for a reunion with ideas that, while you may have been there all along, you didn't recognize them. This is a difficult concept to grasp, but it is also a very important one. So let me try to explain it a different way. I recently had an email exchange with a friend of mine, Alan Barker. Alan and his wife, Joan Churchill, were documentary filmmakers who learned their trade in the 1960s and 70s. And by the way, the more I look at those films, those documentaries from that era, the more I realize that they are, in fact, pretty amazing films and superior in a lot of ways to the films that we are making today, the documentaries we are, at least in the United States. In the United States, they like to always say, this is the golden era of documentary filmmaking. And I'm not really so sure that's true. But anyway, Alan is a sound recordist and Joan is a cinematographer. She shot and co-directed many of the great films that your countryman Nick Broomfield made. I recommend that you have a look at some of these films for yourself. But anyway, Alan is a pretty articulate guy, and so I tend to get in discussions with him about documentary filmmaking. And I also like to include imagery in my emails. So here's a recent exchange I had with Alan, and it includes a pictorial element. Okay, so Alan was asking me about the editor's voice. And he said, to clarify my question about the editor's voice, I'm not talking about the agenda, which is usually built into a project. I'm wondering about the person behind the agenda, the voice of the editor. It might be compared to mood. Two editors with the same agenda are going to make different films. Where does that voice come from, and does it change depending on the project? So I wrote, Dear Alan, there's an ideal moment in every project where you reach the point that the material is speaking to you, or speaking through you. You certainly know what I'm referring to. It is true in every art form. It has become a cliche even. The stone speaks through the sculpture, the sculptor. The music speaks through the pianist. The world speaks through the camera person's eye. As a neophyte screenwriter, I was excited recently when I felt like the characters I invented were speaking through me. I hadn't yet experienced that as a writer, but I knew the feeling quite well from being a film editor. So let us now all put hands on the table. In editing, you should always strive for this ideal moment, particularly in documentary. You dig into the rushes and enter the world of the film. You have to learn to see things the way the rushes see them, to speak the language the rushes speak. Task one is simply to be there in this medium. be awake, look and listen. Do that without imposing too much, and pretty soon you are learning to swim in this particular sea, taking it all in through your cinema gills. You know the ones I mean. Just breathe through them as if normally, and the film will take care of the rest. And listen also to the hypnotic words of the mysterious stranger that drones on in your mind as you try to sleep. Let go, that is what the stranger is saying. Do you hear me? When you are down there in the sea of the rushes, what is often prevalent in your mind is the to-do list you have or have been given about what you want to see in the world and how you are to use this material toward that end. You spoke of this in your email, rightfully calling it an agenda. This agenda is like toxic crude oil clogging your cinema gills. Sputter, sputter. A more wholesome process of looking at rushes involves letting go of all of that, realizing that the sea you are swimming in exists also as its own separate entity, in spite of and often in opposition to what your desires are. This is task one. If you spend all of your energies fighting against the tide of the rushes, you will surely drown. On the other ventral, the more you give into it, this particular image language sea suspends gravity. It takes hold of your body and mind, opens your gills, and flows through them into your fingers, toward the keyboard, and out into the world. Like a musician, like a sculptor. You stop being you and start being a conduit of the particular flow of the particular language of rhythm and emotion created by these particular rushes. Breathe wholesomely through your cinema gills as the film begins to exert its secret influence upon you. Take it and go forward into the world. And yes, it is absolutely different on every film, since the sea of every film is different and establishes its own imagery language. And while presumably I am the same person who edited the last film I edited and took away all the experience I took away from that one and from every other one I did, even so, I am now an entirely new persona, one that might be called me in the context of this particular sea of rushes. That, I suppose, is the editorial persona you were asking about. Do not rebel against it, even though at times it can appear that you are in. Yeah. These things are your friends. This is from this great German silent film called, it's a series of films about Dr. Mabuse. Recommend them. Okay. What I was trying to describe in that email is a process that allows you to open up to the emotional beats that might be contained in images when they're allowed to monstrously overreach whatever limited agenda the film and its filmmakers have been trying to contain them in. What I was describing was a process that opens you up to the emotion and metaphor that is inherent, often mysteriously, in your images. Emotion, I hope you understand, is the vital language of cinema. It is the basis for how cinema engages with its audience, in the same way that in everyday life, emotion is our way of connecting with our innermost feelings and the feelings of others. In everyday life, we learn to understand and empathize with other people, not only through what they say, but also through their facial expressions, their body language, and tone of voice. It is the same thing in cinema, and this is the very thing that connects cinema so essentially to our everyday lives, and gives it its unprecedented power. So in order to speak the language of cinema, you have to create emotion. And one of the ways to do that, perhaps the most effective way, is through metaphor. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always found metaphor to be a bit of an elusive term, particularly with regards to film making, and so I think we should discuss metaphor right now. Are you bored yet? Okay. So this is a visual metaphor. And it's basically just comes out of my, what do you call it, iPhoto or whatever. It was just a weird confluence of images that came one right after the other. That's my alarm clock. And that is an image that I guess I downloaded from the internet. I can't even really tell you where I got that image. But I saw this as a cut from one thing to another in some kind of a random slideshow. And it was like, holy shit, that is something. So in the context of what it might be, if I had some use for it or whatever, I would then start to say, okay, what is that? What is that all about? It's about something epic, but I'm not exactly sure what. So here are some thoughts about metaphor that I gathered from various places, not the least of which was Wikipedia. Metaphor is derived from the Greek roots meta, over, across, or beyond, and for, to carry. So the literal meaning of metaphor is to carry across. You may know that. One of the goals of art is to make objects unfamiliar. As art estranges us from conventions, it reacquaints us with the vividness and monstrous originality of life, thus leading us back to something fresh. Same thing applies to filmmaking, where metaphor is a way of carrying across an emotion by finding an image-based correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which can function to conjure for the audience a particular emotion. Metaphor systematically disorganizes the common sense of things, which I think this does. Jumbling together the abstract with the concrete, the physical with the psychological, the like with the unlike. The paradox of metaphor is that much of what it tells us about a person, place, or thing, it does so by telling us what the person, place, or thing is not. So think about that, and while we should also probably talk about music, because another way we can begin to quantify this mysterious image-based language I am speaking about is through comparing it to the perhaps more familiar experience of the language of music. While cinema incorporates elements from all the arts, painting for sure, dance, theater, architecture, in my view, it is probably most closely related to music. At the very least, the editor's job, manipulating dynamics, emotional flow, and rhythm, is undeniably close to musical composition. Cinema is a language like music also, and that is essentially nonverbal and speaks directly to the emotions. One thing I find weird in both modern documentary and fiction films is that filmmakers seem to be moving away from this emotional language. Filmmakers these days seem always to be trying to cram more words and more information into their films. Perhaps it's because our culture is so information and data and word dependent that we cannot imagine a language being any other way. I personally think this is a huge mistake because, as I said before, I think the essential power of music, of cinema, like music, lies exactly in its ability to speak directly on an emotional plane. Unlike word languages, these languages do not symbolize emotional meaning in a way that requires interpretation. Cinema and music metaphorize emotion. They carry it across directly to our unconscious minds. Another point about music is that it consists entirely of relations, of in-betweenness. Notes mean nothing in and of themselves. It is the silence and tension between the notes that counts for everything. Drama aspires towards this condition of music, and I think you can also say that being alive is much like this condition of music. I suppose this is what people mean when they say that life is a process. Our lives actually happen in between moments. The question of how language should function in film is kind of like comparing the left and right hemispheres of your brains. I'm sure you're aware of theories around this element of neuroscience. I personally find left and right brain theory to be both mind-blowing and at the same time innately innately truthful to the human experience. I'm sure you are aware of the basic idea that the left brain is more analytical, verbal, and the right brain is more intuitive. I'm also sure you understand that both mental processes are important to everyday problem solving. But once again, I tend to want to relate this to modern filmmaking, which I find has become too left brain, too analytical in its approach. I actually believe that this is true of the world in general. We are always looking to reduce things to their constituent parts. We are always saying, yes, I can accept this new concept because I recognize that it is like this other concept that I already know. This is the antithesis of what originality is. Thankfully, not everything can be compartmentalized in this way. Some things have an inexplicable presence or a feel. A person, it seems to me, is an example of something that cannot be reduced to something else. And this is interesting also in that I have always found my relationship with the pieces of music and the films that have really touched me to be very much like relationships I have formed with living people. Great films in my life have reached me by creating a sense of something living, something ever-changing, something alive. In this sense, I feel like our job as people transitioning into being dramatists is something akin to the job that Victor Frankenstein took on for himself in Mary Shelley's indelible story. We are attempting to create structures that contain life. What do I mean when I say a film contains life? When I think of art that has life, I think of the Romantic period of Western art. It's a period in some ways like our own, in that art and philosophy attempted to align themselves with the science of the day. In the Romantic era, living forms had been seen as less of a structure and more of a process or activity that scientists equated with life. I think that's an interesting idea. There existed a theory of life, one which artists attempted to mimic, and the idea is it's a self-propagating power independent of structure. That is an incredibly interesting concept to me, especially considering the resultant idea that this power could, under certain circumstances, go awry. With that in mind, have a look at this image created by another one of your countrymen, William Blake. Let's see if we can discover in it some kind of metaphor for the ideas we've been discussing so far this morning. As humans, we function in the natural world by endlessly creating structures within it, all the while deep down knowing that what makes life life is the very fact that it cannot be contained in structures. We all understand that the possibility ever exists as something crazy, unimagined, or monstrous might happen to any one of us at any time in this life. All you can do at the end of the day is either to attempt to deny this very real fact or else embrace the monstrosity as being an essential ingredient in life. The philosopher Immanuel Kant seemed to come out as an embracer when he said, one of the most wondrous properties of organized creatures is their proclivity to give birth to monsters and malformations. An object is monstrous if by its enormousness it overreaches the purpose that brought it into being. It becomes a power capable of exceeding its organized form simply by virtue of its moreness. What is Blake depicting with these vegetable insect people? Are they monsters? Vegetables are a simple form of life and therefore most subject to regeneration and most prone to monstrosity. These beings seem to me to have this moreness. They seem to be teeming with life in all its forms. They seem to have been assembled in such a way as to make them more than beautiful, more than alive. And so in this sense, they are indeed monstrous. monstrously beautiful. Look at this image and think about what it might mean in the context of the language of cinema. Look at this image and think about how, in your transitioning into being a dramatist, there is a need for you to open up to things that are inexplicable, that are more enormous than your analytical processes are able to contain. Look at this image and try to embrace the monstrous potential of cinematic language, a language of images. That's that. Shit, that took me longer than I thought. All right, so I talked myself out, and I'm happy to answer questions if you want to do that about any of that. The other option is we have some clips we can show from films that maybe in some way display some of this. They have a microphone they're going to hand out if they can ask a question.
It's just about either in editing or creative generally, how do you kind of keep yourself open to the emotion and the subconscious and not kind of, get bored or lose perspective?
Well, there are a lot of techniques for that, and it's a really great question because it's probably the most difficult thing. When you are editing a feature-length film, in the process, let's say that takes 8 months, let's say, and in that 8-month process, you might have 2 or 3 screenings in the entire time when you're not fatigued, when you have enough energy and you're not fatigued enough that you can actually see the thing for what it is. And this is your most precious resource. And one thing I've tried to do in films is, it is very difficult to do, but is to take breaks. So when I edited We Need to Talk About Kevin, this is an extremely complicated film. And fortunately, we had 2 times in the process of editing it where we took an entire month off, which is kind of unheard of. But it was brilliant because when we came back after the month, it was so clear what was wrong with it, or what was working and what wasn't working. So that's one thing, is trying to get your mind off of the thing. And then I'll also try to do a lot of things that will mess with what I think the film is supposed to be about. So if that there's a slideshow I have. Yeah, just in a second here. So yeah, it's okay. Yeah, so just show a bit of this. So this is this film that I just finished with Lynn Ramsey, and it's coming out I think next week, and it's called You Were Never Really Here. And the film is about this one guy, and it's a psychological film. So one thing I did early on in the film, once we had all the rushes, was I asked my assistant to assemble a series of single images that are not him, but only what he might see or have in his mind. And then I wanted to just look at them in random order. And my hope was, number one, it just get me to think differently, get my mind out of what it's supposed to be, as I was talking about earlier, and also maybe even see some kind of weird cut or some kind of weird juxtaposition that might come out of it. So that's another technique. More questions?
When are you brought into the filming process? Like, when are you introduced to the script and everything?
What's the first? What about it?
So, like, when do you
When
are you
do I
from the
come in?
start? Yeah, when do you?
Yeah. Well, it depends. I mean, I've had both experience. I mean, certainly, if it's a scripted documentary like this was, and somebody I work with, we have a relationship. I came in early drafts of the script. and we talked about that, and I made suggestions and all that kind of thing. And then, but that's obviously not usually the case. I did a film called American Honey, and American Honey had a script, but the filmmaker, Andrea Arnold, I had never worked with her before. She was awesome, and the first thing she said to me, well, on the first meeting we had, she told me a little bit about what it was about, the story, and then somehow we came to the decision that I wouldn't read the script, because she liked the fact that I'd done a lot of documentary. So what would happen, what if I didn't read the script? What if I didn't know what was happening? Because one of the things in American Honey is there are a lot of characters in it. And she just, one of her concerns was she didn't want the characters all to just be wallpaper. She wanted them all to stand out as individuals. And that was, I thought, okay, well, one way is, what if I don't even know who's important? What if I have to look at each person like they could be the main character? So that was an exciting conception. It was also a really funny way to work, because I didn't, but we worked where she would come to me and we would look at about 2 weeks worth of rushes, and then I would cut for a period of time, and I would cut those 2 weeks of rushes, and then she would come back and I was, do you want to see what I cut? No, let's just keep going on. I think she was pretty burned out. I found that incredibly trusting, and I really appreciated it since I'd never worked with her before. And then we do another 2 weeks, and I'd cut it, another 2 weeks. Now my assistant read the script, so he knew what was going on. And it was actually like, we were like 3 months into the film, and I was like, what's gonna happen? I was really interested. I was scared that something bad was gonna happen. So it was a fascinating way to work. So there's but then other films, and then there's a whole kind of question of whether it's a good thing for the editor to be on the set, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. I've had good and bad experiences with it. So we have a clip from American Honey, how's that for a segue, that will allow me to stop talking for about 3 minutes. So why don't we try that? The bar scene? Yeah, okay. about Andrea Arnold's style of filmmaking. Is that a good idea? Yeah, I never worked with her before. My impression was that Andrea basically creates this world and then sort of shoots a documentary in it or something like that. So it was a really exciting way to, and very, very difficult way film to edit. She has the most amazing DP. You probably all know Robbie Ryan. If you don't know, you should know because she's awesome. And so they shot a ton of film. I mean, just video. I mean, digital, but they shot a ton of it. And there were just so many amazing moments. And to me, it was so teeming with like real life. It felt so real to me that it was just really hard to try to get it down to something. And this is a pretty good example of that. It was the most difficult scene I've ever edited, probably, certainly one of the top ones. And the reason for that is because if this was a Hollywood film, the way you would have done that scene is you would have, all the stuff going on in the room would have been silent. They would not have been playing music, they would just be doing the dance and, you know, whatever. And so that they get clean dialogue. And this was the opposite. Everything was exactly like that. So there's one line of ADR in it, I can't even tell you what it is, but everything else was just exactly recorded, exactly how it was. And so there's this incredible energy in it that you could not have replicated or created any other way. However, now just think for one moment what that means to the editing. Because those were non-professional actors. So the dialogue was different every single time. That's number one. So just trying to get them to say the lines and that to work was one thing, which you normally would encounter. But then there was the fact that there's this music playing, and the music is it has to be contiguous. You know what I'm saying? You can't cut in the middle of music. So their dialogue has to fit in the music. The music has to flow. And that's really difficult. And then there's the most difficult part of it. They're dancing in the background. And so that's really, and Andrea was really specific about the dancing. In fact, to her was almost the most important part. So you also had to do the choreography of the dancing correctly. And when I first looked at it, and when I first got the concept of what it was going to take the editor to edit this scene, I first thought, it just can't be done. It's just not possible. But I very quickly, okay, but I'm going to try, you know, and I made it work. So I was really proud of that. Is there any question? Yeah. Or am I can't see. Oh, there we go.
What to you is like, what kind of director and what qualities of director like preferred by you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm up for anything, but I mean, you're asking me what kind of directors I like to work with, is that what you're saying? Yeah, so I'm up for anything, but at this point, I mean, the difficulty in documentary, I stopped doing documentary for the most part a while ago. And the reason is because it takes, on a normal unscripted documentary, it takes about 3 months to go through the footage, 2 or 3 months. And it's only at that point that you really even know whether it's going to work. And obviously at that point, it's a bit late to be saying to somebody, well, I don't think I'm the right person for this job, after they've been paying you. So I got into a thing where it's like, I just had to feel very confident that the director, filmmaker, knew what they were doing and could deliver. So one thing, I work with the same filmmaker, Werner Herzog, for 20 years, 27 films. And so we obviously, you know, I'm pretty confident in his abilities as a filmmaker. And we had a system that we, you know, I don't want to call it a system, but we had a way of making films that worked mostly, for the most part. Not in every film, but it worked, you know. And then another significant relationship I have and continue to have is with Lynn Ramsey. And Lynn is a very visually oriented, imagistic oriented filmmaker. So the things I was talking about earlier, I think are very much defined by Lynn's filmmaking, because it's very much about the sound. It's very much, so this film that will be coming out soon, You Were Never Really Here, you know, I hadn't seen it in a while, and it played at Sundance Film Festival, and so I saw it, and I was like, holy shit, man, it's like the last 45 minutes of this film has about 2 lines of dialogue in it. The whole last half of it has so little dialogue, it's mind-blowing. And yet you're never lost, or you never think, why is there not more dialogue? That never occurs to you, because the flow of things is right, and the emotional intensity is there. So that's something is really important for me with a director. People here.
How do you know when to stop editing when it's finished?
How do you know when to stop editing? Well, it depends on the film. Like, a good example is American Honey, because the first cut of American Honey was like 4 hours long. I don't know, 3.5 hours long. I don't really remember. And it was great. I thought it was great. I thought it really worked. And but you know, obviously it was like, it's too long. So we went through, and I mean, it was an interesting process actually. She went through, there was a period where I took a break. This had been arranged beforehand. I took a month off, and I went back to the States. I was dealing with personal things, and while I was gone, she worked with our assistant, who was also a very fine editor in her own right, Rebecca Lloyd, and she, and they just radically cut it down, just to freak out, you know, like a freak out cut. They just cut shit out of it. And we saw that. It was still long. It was still, you know, 3 hours long. But it was a cool thing to have them do. And then I came back and was like, oh wow, you can do that. And then we got it down to like 2.5. I think it's 2:35 is what it is right now. And I was just like, I don't know what else to cut out of this. I really don't know what else to cut out of it. And we had absolutely fantastic relationship with the funders, which partly was BFI and Film Floor. They were just excellent. And they said at one point, we would be remiss if we did not say to you that the film would be seen by more people if it was shorter. And I was like, man, I totally get that. I totally understand that. You know, it's a film where really nothing happens, but you would think it would be 90 minutes long, really. But it's 2.5 hours long, and that's a testament to the filmmaking. And I totally understood that, but at the same time, it's like, well, what would you cut out? What would you cut out? And all the things you could cut out were the things there was just no way we were going to cut out. You know, it was the whole thing I said before. We did not want the 12 characters in the film to just be wallpaper and saying one line. We did not want, music plays a very important part in the film. We did not want the music to just come on for 20 seconds and go away. So that was the fundamental thing we agreed on early on. And so that was just an artistic decision, and that's when we said, but it was so difficult to edit the thing that I felt like I could have been editing it for 3 years. And so it was just some point where we said, this is it. And a lot of times that is what it is, because I fortunately worked with filmmakers who have power, who have creative control for the most part. You know, you listen to comments, you take them in, but they are all able to say when they think the film is done with. And so You Were Never Really Here was a really interesting example because we had a pretty good cut of it. No way did we think it was done, but it got into Cannes. We didn't even know we didn't have a great relationship with the producers, and they entered it in the Cannes. We didn't, and they said, "Okay, it got into Cannes." Like, what? So we finished it. We did a really rough mix. It played in Cannes, and it won like Best Actor or Best Screenplay. And it's like, okay, well, should we go back and edit it some more? I mean, that's a legitimate question at this point. But we had always intended to, so we did. We went back and really put a fine polish on the picture edit, and did a few significant things. But what we really did was we spent 6 weeks on the audio. And in Lynn's kind of filmmaking, the audio is as important as the picture. So when I saw it at Sundance, I was like, wow, it was so much better, I thought. And I could have probably been talked into leaving it in a certain way, as it was again. So it's weird how that comes out. What do you say?
You spoke about an editor's agenda or filmmakers in general and how it influences the overall product of the film. How do you characterize your own personal agenda? Is it ethical, political, aesthetic, all of them?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question for someone who's transitioning from being an editor to being a film director or a screenwriter. Because as an editor, that was never, as an editor, ethics was never a huge question for me. So I did a film with Werner Herzog called Into the Abyss, which is about death row in the United States. Phenomenal film. And it covers it from characters from all angles of death row. And obviously there's a huge ethical question about it generally. How do you feel about, people being put to death? But that was the filmmaker's question. See, he explored that in the shooting of the film. And my thing as an editor, I mean, really mostly is aesthetically. I'm much more into the aesthetics of a film, and that can be dangerous. I've had experiences where I edited a film, when it ultimately came out, I realized I felt like I'd been duped. It was just not something I wanted to say. But I had been completely, as always, I get involved in the aesthetics. I get involved in all the shit we were talking about this morning. That's my brain. My brain is, how do you speak this language? I really feel like one of my first jobs actually here was I got hired to do a science documentary series about DNA, and I needed the money, so I took the job. And when I came out, I was like, what am I doing? I know absolutely nothing about this subject. I don't know anything about science. I don't know anything. And I realized very quickly, yeah, but that's not my job. My job is to translate this thing into the language of film. And so that's what I mean by aesthetics. I mean, that's what I tend to concentrate on. Now, when you move into you're the filmmaker, I think that's a much different question now. And so it's something I'm just trying to figure out. Is there more water? Another question? Oh, yeah.
How much freedom do you have as an editor? Because working with directors, obviously in their vision, how much freedom do you have?
Well, I mean, that depends on who the people you're working with. But I demand a lot of freedom. I've been around for a while, so and so if you hire me, it's because you want to work with me. And I need a lot of freedom. It's never been an issue. I mean, after a certain point in my career, it wasn't. So for me, it all happened through working with Werner. And the first several films, they were my first films. So, I mean, I was just trying to not fuck up. And I was just trying to keep up with him. And I really very quickly got quite frustrated with that. I didn't understand why we were doing certain things. Like, a lot of it was fabulous and it was poetic and it was like, wow, that is mind-blowing. I would never have conceived that. And other bits of it were like, well, I don't like that. And this is what I was saying about learning to disagree, learning to say, and that is a very difficult person to disagree with. He doesn't like to be disagreed with. But over the course of 27 films, about film, let's say 8 or 9 or 10 or 12, I started just through proving that I could do, I knew what the hell I was doing. Actually, the film was Grizzly Man. And that was the first film we did where we had a producer who had some power. Otherwise, before that, it had just been when Werner says it's done, it's done. When Werner says this, it's, blah, blah, blah. This film had a producer, and after we cut for a very brief period of time, Werner was like, that's it, it's done. And I was like so frustrated, I wanted to kill myself. Because the film was had such potential to be an amazing film. And fortunately, the producer was like, well, listen, guys, 2 weeks editing, is great, but I think you should spend at least another couple weeks, don't you? So he allowed me to do that. He gave me he backed me up on it, and the film became, 1,000% better.
Have you ever worked with a director who's come to the edit sometime after shooting the film? And is there any benefit, do you think, to that?
The director comes to the edit after it's been cut.
Yeah, so there's like a delay.
Yeah, I have. She's next. Oh, this is going away. She's next. Yeah, I have. It can. Well, I mean, in a certain way, like what I was describing with Andrea. I mean, Andrea was so burnt out after doing that film that she was like, do I have to, how much do you need me? Not in any kind of, like, I didn't feel at all like she was being irresponsible. It was just like how, there was a ton of footage. There was but it was scary because I didn't know her, and I didn't know if she would like what I was going to do. And then I told you, she didn't even look at what I did. So you can imagine that the first time we saw the cuts of the film, of any of the scenes in the film, as I recall, was when we watched a 4-hour cut of it. And I'm sitting there thinking, I hope she likes what I'm doing. And fortunately, she did. And she was really great about, oh yeah, it's great. But then always, I knew in the back of her mind, saying, okay, it's not that, this is what she wanted to fix, which we did over time. So there's been that, and then there's been certainly documentaries when I work with neophyte or young filmmakers or people that made a lot of film, that they put a lot of trust in me, and I did this thing. I did some kind of cut, but I especially in that circumstances, I want to show people cuts very early, because again, it's a language thing. Am I speaking the language of your film, or how your DOP shot, or all of that? Because that's a big part of it as well. Am I cutting it in a way? And a lot of times you struggle with it. And I struggled a lot in documentary with DOPs, because I worked with some phenomenal DOP. The guy that shot Werner's films, Peter Zeitlinger, was a phenomenal DOP in the same sense that Robbie Ryan is a phenomenal DOP. You just kind of have to get out of the way, because they are shooting the thing. They're making it happen. You just get out of the way. But most of the experiences I've had in my life was, I don't get how you're shooting this. You're shooting it so statically and so boringly and so unnarratively that it's all on me, which is boring and awful and shitty.
Do you feel like the thesis of a film that a director kind of believes in often changes when they come to an edit? And if so, do you feel a responsibility to shape that? Because it's interesting that you talk about aesthetics and that's what you're interested in, but do you often have to kind of switch to unpaid therapist at any point and help them figure out what it's really about?
Yeah. So your question is, are there things that I change my mind about? Or, yeah, I mean, definitely.
Or a director changes their mind about. Or a director changes their mind.
Yeah, sure, right. So, yeah, I got you. So, again, 27 films of Werner Herzog. The most important process, the process we always used was, we worked together to watch the rushes. And so, and he'd take notes. And I never looked at the notes, but what the notes was a communication between us about what we thought was good and bad. And so I was very clear on what we thought was good and bad, because we both know that's going to change. But you know, and so we would do that, and you would, and a lot of that is the analytical brain thing. Where would this go? How does it work? Blah, blah, blah. But then you also, in that moment, is you wanted to be open to things that just got you and you don't know why. So they had this idea of kindling, like something with which you will start fires. And kindling could just be anything. It could be like the camera is drifting off. It could be things. It's just somehow that's interesting. And so you put all of those somewhere. And in that kind of filmmaking, which was very narration-based, there were sort of two forms of narration. This is just like left and right brain. There was this analytical narration that got you from A to B, but then the really great stuff was the kind of poetic narration. And so that all of the narration was always done at the moment that you're making the film. It's done in the editing room as you're going along. It's not done after, it's not done before. It's never done like, here's a bunch of narration, put pictures on it. Or here's a bunch of pictures, put narration on it. It's done exactly at the same time. So you end up building these structures, sentence structures, that are completely based on how the film images are coming down. So it's this very strange style of actual word writing, which is fascinating. And so, does that answer your questions? We've got time for one more question. I'm sorry to say. You already asked one, sorry, so somebody else gets two.
What's the best way you can form a healthy relationship with a director?
Alcohol. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, it's different with every person. I mean, really, the large part of the job, if you want to be an editor, I don't want to be cynical about it, but there's so much of what you do is psychotherapy, and honestly, that's such a big part of what I have. It's part of what burned me out over time. Is you have to prop this person up a lot. They're these amazing artistic people, and they're, you can imagine, and so that's a lot of what you had to do, and a lot of it. So you have to learn to kind of speak on that language, and you get into all this interpersonal stuff. And really, that's why it's rare that you can just do one film with somebody and have it be good. I have had that experience, but it's rare. Because it's a process of learning how people work and how they think and what it takes them to get, what does it take Lynn Ramsey to focus and these kinds of things. That's a big part of the job. I can't say any kind of general thought about it because each person is so intensely different.
You played music with Lynn.
What?
You played music with Lynn.
Lynn and I played music together. That was helpful, yeah. That was actually really helpful. It was a good thing that we would do. We just started jamming. It was just a weird way to kind of see how she thinks. One more or no? One more. There was that. Maybe two more. Okay.
Hi. My question's you're talking about embracing disagreement, and how do you go about that? And also, how much is it a vision of the editor as well as of the director, emotionally more than physically? Embracing. I'm sorry. Give her the microphone back because I'm going to ask her a question. Thank you. Embracing what? Embracing disagreement. Disagreement. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's. Another way to look at it isn't so much disagreement. I mean, it is disagreement, but there are many ways to look at anything. So, like when I was saying, Werner and I looking at the Russians, you say, okay, this is what I don't like. Let's put it this way: is when a director says, okay, here's a scene I'd like you to watch the Russians for. The scene is about this. I really didn't like that guy. I think he was lying. And it's like, okay, well, you may say that. I didn't see that. I didn't think the scene was about that, and I didn't think he was lying, or the opposite. So I don't like that, and I found more and more with, young filmmakers, it's always a mistake young directors make. Yeah, we went out and we shot and it was bad, and this is what happened. And that's inexperience, because you don't know what happened. That's what you learned. And well, you don't know until you see the rushes. And young directors tend to talk about all kinds of shit that's irrelevant. She was really angry in the whole morning. She wouldn't, and the actress, and she wouldn't eat her breakfast and blah, blah. I don't care. All I care about is what's on the screen. I don't need any of that. It's part of why I'm learning I don't really like to go to the set. I don't even like to formulate an opinion about, such and such actor is kind of an asshole. But he's not supposed to be an asshole in this film. So you have to work with that, or documentaries. So you can look at things in a lot of different ways. And I like with Werner, we would watch something, and it would kind of be, well, what did you see in that? Well, I saw that the guy was this, or I saw that. It's like, well, I didn't see that at all. I saw this. And so that is a disagreement, but it's just more acknowledging that because the language of cinema is multifaceted, things can be read in different ways. Once again, this why I don't like words, because when somebody says yada yada yada, especially in an interview, well, that's pretty much yada 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 in a lot of people's minds. And for me, it's like in the interviews, I can't stand when they give you a paper cut. It's like, wow, that's the thing I'm least interested in, is what they're saying. I want to see what they look like. I want to see what their gestures are. I want to see what moments that I believe. So even in an interview, I still think all that stuff applies. That's that. All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys. I'm not going to come up and say anything.